If you're a gamer and you're wondering whether a gaming-focused projector is that much better than every other projector on the market, they are, and this video is for you. I've got 5 of the most highly recommended gaming projectors on the market, and in this completely unsponsored video, I'll be putting them through a huge range of tests to first figure out if they're better than non-gaming projectors, and second to see if they can possibly compete with high-end TVs or gaming-focused monitors. Spoiler alert, they can, and this one, the BENQ X500i, is one of the best all-around projectors I've ever tested, not just for gaming stuff. Starting with the least expensive in this video at $1,592, the ViewSonic X2-4K is a short-throw DLP projector with an RGB LED light source that ViewSonic claims can produce 2,900 LED lumens. But unfortunately, LED lumens are a deceptive marketing term, and in my testing using the ANSI lumen standard, it was only able to produce around 1,800 ANSI lumens on its brightest mode and around 1,100 ANSI lumens in its movie and game modes. However, the X2-4K did have very respectable contrast numbers with around 1,500 to 1 native contrast and over 3,000 to 1 in dynamic black mode. The gaming-focused X2-4K has made for Xbox branding with 2 HDMI 2.0 ports that both support 1080p at 240Hz, 1440p at 120Hz, and 4K at 60Hz. After that, for $1599 is the ViewSonic LX700-4K, which is a standard throw DLP projector with a single laser light source, which ViewSonic says is capable of producing 3,500 ANSI lumens. And in my testing, it had just under 2,750 ANSI lumens on its brightest setting, around 1,800 ANSI lumens in movie mode, and close to 2,000 ANSI lumens in gaming mode, which doesn't live up to the 3,500 ANSI lumen claim from ViewSonic, but it is still extremely bright. The native contrast of the LX700 was around 1,800 to 1, and using dynamic mode it reached over 5,000 to 1. But as we'll see later on in the side-by-side testing, the dynamic dimming is slow and noticeable, so you probably won't want to use it. Just like the X2-4K, the LX700-4K has made for Xbox branding with 2 HDMI 2.0 ports and supports 1080p 240, 1440p 120Hz, and 4K at 60Hz. Next, for $1699 is the BENQ X500i, which like the X2-4K is a short-throw DLP projector with an LED light source, which BENQ says can produce 2,200 ANSI lumens, and in my testing it was just short of that at 1,950 ANSI lumens in its brightest setting and around 1,150 ANSI lumens in both movie mode and gaming mode, which is extremely similar to the X2-4K. Also, like the X2-4K, the native contrast of the X500i was around 1,550 to 1, and in dynamic mode that number increased to just over 3,000 to 1. The X500i also has 2 HDMI 2 ports and also supports 1080p 240, 1440p 120Hz, and 4K at 60Hz. Then jumping up quite a bit in price to $2,399 is the Flagship BENQ X3100i, a standard throw DLP projector with an LED light source that BENQ says can produce 3,300 ANSI lumens. And in my testing it was extremely bright at around 2,930 ANSI lumens in its brightest mode and just under 2,000 lumens in both movie mode and game modes, making it one of the brightest projectors I've ever tested. Unfortunately, the contrast wasn't all that impressive, with just under 900 to 1 native contrast and 1,530 to 1 in dynamic mode. And like the rest of the projectors so far, the X3100i has 2 HDMI 2.0 ports supporting 1080p 240Hz, 1440p 120Hz, and 4K 60Hz. Switching gears a little bit, for $2,699 is the Nexigo Aurora Pro, a DLP ultra short throw projector with a triple laser light source. Nexigo says the Aurora Pro can put out 2,400 ANSI lumens, and in my testing paired with the Formovie Fresnel screen, it actually exceeds that with around 2,700 lumens and an insane contrast ratio at just under 6,000 to 1. And the reason that I'm including it in this video is in addition to its great home theater performance, it also has some of the lowest input lag that I've ever measured on its 3 HDMI 2.1 ports, supporting 1080p 240Hz and even 4K 120Hz input, even though the DLP chip isn't capable of that, so it displays 4K 60Hz by dropping every other frame. And then last, making a big jump in price up to $3,999 is the Epson LS11000, which I often see suggested by people looking for a gaming projector because it's one of the few projectors on the market that supports 4K at 120Hz. The LS11000 is a standard throw 3 LCD projector with a single laser light source, which Epson says can produce 2,500 ANSI lumens, and in my testing it got very close to that in its brightest mode at 2,401 ANSI lumens, and it had around 1,450 ANSI lumens in bright cinema mode. The LS11000's contrast ratio has a huge variation based on picture mode, but in its most accurate picture mode, it's just over 2000 to 1 with its laser dimming completely disabled, and over 5000 to 1 with high-speed dynamic dimming. The LS11000 has two HDMI 2.1 ports, which are necessary to support 4K 120Hz, and you'll also need a 48 gigabit per second HDMI cable to support those resolutions. When I started doing my research for this video, the biggest question I had to answer is what makes a projector better or worse for gaming? And it's really just two things, both related to refresh rate. So we'll start with the easiest one. Input lag is usually explained as the amount of time in between when you press a button on your controller or keyboard and when that action gets displayed on the screen. But it's also the amount of time in between when something happens in the game and when you see it on the screen. And that's just as, if not more important. In my non-gaming projector reviews, I generally say that input lag numbers under 20 milliseconds are good for competitive gaming, between 20 and 50 milliseconds is acceptable for casual gaming, 50 to 100 starts to feel a little weird, and over 100 milliseconds of input lag can make some game types basically unplayable. However, these gaming-focused projectors are all about shaving off as much input lag as possible. And the minimum input lag for any resolution can be calculated by dividing 1000 milliseconds by the refresh rate. So for 4K 60 Hz, you'd divide 1000 by 60, and you'd get 16.7 milliseconds as the absolute minimum. And then anything over that is extra lag that's added by the projector's image processing. Testing with the industry standard Leo Bodner lag tester, you can see that the two projectors from BenQ and the two from ViewSonic added less than 1/10 of a millisecond of input lag at 4K 60, while the Nexigo Aurora Pro added a little over 1 millisecond and the Epson added about 3 milliseconds. Increasing that refresh rate will decrease the input lag, and at 1080p 120Hz, the theoretical minimum is 8.4 milliseconds. And again, the BenQ and ViewSonic projectors all added less than half a millisecond, while the Nexigo Aurora Pro added around 4 milliseconds for processing, and the Epson LS11000's input lag was actually worse than it was at 4K 60 when outputting at 1080p 120Hz, exceeding that 20 milliseconds of lag time that's generally the cutoff for competitive gaming. Stepping up to 1080p 240Hz, the theoretical minimum is just 4.2 milliseconds. And again, the ViewSonic and BenQ projectors were right at that number. And while the Aurora Pro did improve slightly from its 120Hz input lag, it was still more than double the theoretical minimum. And unfortunately, the LS11000 doesn't support 240Hz at all. But higher refresh rates don't just reduce input lag. And the second thing that separates gaming projectors from home theater projectors is their ability to resist motion blur, meaning that it's easier to see the exact position of objects during quick movements of the in-game camera. To test motion blur, I used the very popular UFO testing suite from Blurbusters, and I ran 4 separate tests on each projector. First were the subjective tests, and I connected each projector to my RTX 4080 gaming computer, and I set them to their maximum refresh rate and started with the Blurbusters test UFO frame rate comparison. Then I gradually increased the speed of the UFOs, and I tracked them manually by moving my head and eyes until I could see noticeable motion blur. And this was pretty mind-blowing to me because I was able to increase the speed all the way up to 1920 pixels per second before I noticed any blur on the ViewSonic and BenQ projectors at 1080p 240Hz and 240 frames per second. And the Nexigo Aurora Pro was only slightly worse than that, finally showing the slightest bit of motion blur at 1440 pixels per second. The Epson LS11000, on the other hand, at 1080p 120Hz was way worse, and the motion blur was very noticeable at just 240 pixels per second. I also did a similar test using the Blurbusters Dota scrolling test, where I gradually increased the speed until I could no longer read the Tidehunter text. And the gaming projectors from BenQ and ViewSonic maxed out my ability to move my eyes and head fast enough, and I was still able to read the Tidehunter text at 3840 pixels per second, while the Aurora Pro became unreadable around 2880 pixels per second. And I kid you not, if you didn't already know that it said Tidehunter, you wouldn't be able to read it on the Epson LS11000 even at the slowest 960 pixels per second. So what in the world is going on here? To understand, we need to talk a little bit about how these projectors work. DLP projectors make an image by loading a single frame into their memory and then breaking it up into red, green, and blue subframes. It then aligns each pixel in its digital micromirror chip to correspond with the red subframe, and it flashes the red LED. Then it does the same for green and then blue. And because our eyes have something called persistence of vision, our brains can combine those 3 color subframes into a full color image. The mirrors on a DLP chip move 3 times per frame at up to 240 frames per second, for a total of 720 precise movements of each pixel every single second. Complicating things even further, the most commonly used DLP chips are only 1080p native resolution. So to make a 4K image, they break each frame into red, green, and blue subframes, and then they break it down even further into top left, top right, bottom right, bottom left pixels. And then the chip itself is shifted in a circle to allow it to draw 4 distinct pixels for each mirror on the chip. And that works out to be 3 RGB subframes times 4 pixels times 60 times per second, which gives us that same 720 movements per second as the 1080p 240Hz image, but this time drawing 4K at 60 Hz. However, the Epson uses a completely different system with 3 black and white LCD screens. Projectors like the LS11000 take a full color frame and they break it down into red, green, and blue subframes that it then displays on those 3 black and white LCD screens. It shines a red light through one screen, a green light through another, and a blue light through the third, and then those 3 light beams are recombined and all projected onto the screen at the same time. The problem is when compared to micromirrors, LCDs are extremely slow when it comes to turning off one pixel and turning another one on. So the transition from one frame to the next is not instant, and even at high refresh rates, the LCDs themselves create motion blur. To show this more clearly, I used the Pursuit camera setup on Blurbusters, where I put a DSLR camera on rails and manually tracked the UFO image. First, at 1080p 120Hz and 120 frames per second, you can see that the DLP image on the left is significantly crisper and has a lot more detail than the 3 LCD image on the right. But it does show the biggest weakness of DLP projectors, which is that the thin white lines turn into rainbows because each color is being projected consecutively rather than simultaneously like in a 3 LCD image. And instead of motion blur, the most obvious artifact on the DLP image is that the front of the spaceship is slightly green and the back of it is slightly red. Upping the refresh rate to 240 Hz on the DLP chip results in an even clearer image, with virtually no motion blur even when moving at 960 pixels per second. And you can see that the ViewSonic X2-4K, BENQ X500i, and X3100i all had nearly perfect 240 Hz performance, while the ViewSonic LX700-4K had some strange artifacting showing double black lines on the spaceship and alternating RGB BGR white lines at the top, likely as the result of using a single laser with a color wheel instead of individual color LEDs. The Nexigo Aurora Pro also handled 1080p 240 Hz surprisingly well, but you can see that each individual pixel is smaller and the relative space in between the pixels is larger, leading to what we call the screen door effect. And that's because the Aurora Pro uses the popular 0.47-inch Texas Instruments micromirror chip, while all the gaming-specific projectors are using the 0.65-inch chip. And a bigger chip with the same number of mirrors means every mirror is slightly bigger. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video that gaming-focused projectors are absolutely different from non-gaming projectors. And to show that, I set up the same test with the JMGO N1 Ultra, which does support 1080p 240Hz input, but it doesn't actually reduce motion blur, because as you can see from the sync track, that instead of having the 4 distinct segments that line up, the N1 only displays one segment. Because even though it accepts a 240 Hz signal, it just drops 3 out of every 4 frames and it displays it at 60 Hz. But enough lab testing, I also put them through testing of a few of my favorite games. And all of the PC games played perfectly on the gaming-specific projectors from BenQ and ViewSonic, and the only issue that I had was on the Xbox. Even after setting the resolution to 1440p 120 Hz, it would often just switch to 4K 60 on its own when I loaded a game. So I had to manually disable 4K in the Xbox video options to make sure that it would stay at 120 Hz. The Epson LS11000, on the other hand, didn't perform well at all with PC gaming, and it would randomly lose its video signal when setting 4K 120 Hz or 1080p 120 Hz, and I noticed that at 4K 120 in Heroes of the Storm, there was some strange video artifacts happening between my mana and HP bars, almost like it couldn't decide how many pixels were supposed to go there. On Xbox, the LS11000 seemed to perform slightly better as far as input lag when I set it to 4K 120 Hz compared to 4K 60 Hz, but I honestly couldn't tell any difference in motion blur between the two settings, and 4K 120 seemed to be slightly lower resolution, probably due to the limitations of the Xbox itself, since even though it says that it can output 4K 120, there's really no way that it can render games at that resolution and refresh rate, so it was probably using 1440p or even 1080p when 4K 120 was selected. The Aurora Pro handled PC gaming perfectly and had low motion blur and great response time, but on the Xbox I definitely preferred manually setting it to 1080p 120 Hz and disabling 4K completely in comparison to just setting it to 4K 120. And that applies to both input lag and motion clarity. And that's because the Xbox itself has to lower the resolution to render 4K 120, but then the Aurora Pro was dropping half the frames. So the end result was a lower resolution and a lower refresh rate, probably equivalent to 1440p 60 Hz. So for pure gaming performance, the ViewSonic X2-4K, the BENQ X500i, and the X3100i are basically identical, and the ViewSonic LX700-4K was just slightly worse than that, with similar input lag but more artifacts in motion testing from the use of that single laser and color wheel light source. The Nexigo Aurora Pro performed surprisingly well with great input lag and excellent performance at 1080p 240Hz, but I definitely wouldn't recommend using it at 1440 120 or 4K 120 because both of them have significantly worse performance than the 1080p resolutions. And unfortunately, the Epson LS11000 was kind of a mess at high refresh rates, and I'm not sure there's any real benefit to using 120Hz over 60Hz when the motion blur limitations seem to be from the LCD screens themselves rather than the frame rate or refresh rate. And the input lag at 120Hz was more than the input lag at 60Hz. And if you're watching this video, I'm guessing that gaming performance is a top priority for you, but what about if you just want to watch some sports, TVs, or movies? I started out by testing each projector's color space coverage and color accuracy using Calman Ultimate 2024 and a Portrait C6 colorimeter, and then I put each projector head-to-head viewing SDR and HDR content on their most color accurate modes, starting with the ViewSonic LX700-4K on the left and the ViewSonic X2-4K on the right. And the LX700 was comparatively extremely bright, which not only applied to bright scenes, but unfortunately also to dark scenes, where the black levels were extremely raised. And unlike the X2-4K, which had a very usable dynamic black mode, the LX700-4K dimmed its laser in noticeable steps that were extremely distracting and not something that I would ever consider using. During bright scenes, the LX700 actually looked slightly more color accurate than the X2-4K, despite a relatively low color accuracy in Calman, but in dark scenes, the LX700 was noticeably worse, with lower peak brightness and a poor gamma curve in eco mode, and very poor black levels in full power mode, making it a pretty easy win for the X2-4K. So next, the two short throw projectors went head to head, the BENQ X500i on the left and the ViewSonic X2-4K on the right. And in bright scenes, it was no contest, with the X500i's superior color accuracy and color temperature. And despite an average delta error of 4.3, in person, this is about as close as I've seen a projector come to the reference image as far as shadows, highlights, and skin tones. And in dark scenes, the two projectors were almost identical, with the X500i being slightly brighter overall. And if I raise the exposure, you can see that that means that the X500i had a slightly elevated black floor compared to the X2-4K, but both of them were extremely good in SDR content. But the X500i handled HDR significantly better, with a much more watchable gamma curve and more accurate colors. So even though the X2-4K and X500i both looked very similar and overall did great, I thought that the color tuning, HDR, and motion performance on the X500i was slightly better across the board, moving it on to the next round. So on the left is the BENQ X500i, and on the right is the BENQ X3100i. And in person, in bright scenes, my eyes favored the brighter X3100i. And I think that's mostly because the brightness gave it the illusion of better contrast in the shadows, and it really accentuated the shininess of Henry's skin. But when comparing the footage to the raw reference file, the X500i is just perfectly spot on in a way that I've never seen before. And moving into dark scenes, the X500i's black level was roughly 4 times darker than the X3100i, and it really showed with the 3100i looking pretty gray and muddy in low APL scenes. And oddly, in HDR, the two projectors were almost identical in HDR10 mode without the wide color gamut filter engaged, but after engaging the filter on the X3100i, the image on the X500i was significantly better in brightness, contrast, and color accuracy, and I personally couldn't see myself ever using the WCG filter on the X3100i, despite the increase in color space coverage. So very surprisingly, in my side-by-side testing, the lower budget X500i outperformed the higher priced X3100i by what I felt like was a significant margin. So in the next round, I put the X500i on the left and the Epson LS11000 on the right. And in bright SDR content, the LS11000 looked really good, but it was quite a bit warmer and more saturated than the X500i, which again, compared to the source, is probably too warm and too saturated. In dark scenes, both projectors looked very good, and I think that the correct color temperature and saturation was somewhere right in the middle of both images. But the thing that really stuck out to me was the much better black levels on the X500i. And in a previous video, I had mentioned the LS11000's black levels looked a little bit blue to me, but I did a pretty bad job filming it. So this time I set my camera to auto exposure, which really exaggerates the muddy blacks on the Epson, and they definitely still looked blue to me and not nearly as dark as the X500i, so the X500i moves on again. So last, we've got the $1,699 BENQ X500i on the left and the $2,699 Nexigo Aurora Pro on the right, paired with a $750 Formovie Fresnel screen. And as difficult as this is for me to say, I think that in a dark room in SDR content, I preferred the X500i. From a movie watching perspective, the motion handling was top notch, the gamma settings didn't crush any shadow detail or blow out any highlights, and as we've seen, the color accuracy is just about perfect. However, HDR and Dolby Vision were a completely different story, and the Nexigo Aurora Pro looked much better in both light and dark scenes. But for under $2,000, the X500i's picture quality is just crazy to me. And if you're in the market for a gaming projector or home theater projector and you can make a short throw projector work in your setup, I think the X500i should be at the top of your list. But unfortunately, it's not quite perfect, so let's talk about the bad stuff. First, probably the only reason that you wouldn't want to buy the X500i is the noise, because the X500i was the loudest projector in this video by a pretty significant margin. However, unlike some projectors I've tested that have obnoxiously loud fans, the X500i's problem is its pixel shifting XPR motor, which is unbearably loud at 4K 60 Hz. The good news is that very little content actually uses 4K 60 Hz, and if you're a gamer, you probably want to target either 1080p 240 Hz or 120 Hz. And those two resolutions don't use the pixel shifting motor at all, and as a result are significantly quieter. And if you're watching movies and shows, those are shot in the cinematic 4K 24p, and the X500i's XPR motor has a different, much quieter noise at 24 Hz. But if gaming at 4K 60 Hz is your goal, you're going to want to either turn up your speakers or better yet just go with the similarly performing but less color accurate ViewSonic X2-4K, which has a much quieter XPR motor. The other thing that the X500i is missing is MEMC, which is true of all the BenQ and ViewSonic projectors in this video. So if you're someone who likes that ultra smooth motion for watching sports, the Nexigo Aurora Pro is the most capable gaming projector that I've seen that also supports motion smoothing MEMC. The other thing that the Nexigo has going for it is its ability to use ultra short throw specific ambient light rejecting screens that make all the difference in the world for lights on viewing. But interestingly, while they don't work quite as well as the Nexigo, the short throw ratio of the X500i and X2-4K work a lot better than standard throw projectors with the Formovie Fresnel screen. Though I have noticed that the circular Fresnel ridges are visible in some scenes when using a non-UST projector. For good measure, I also tested speaker quality, and among the gaming specific projectors, the X2-4K and X500i were the top performers, followed closely by the X3100i, while the built-in speakers on the ViewSonic LX700-4K are horrible and you absolutely wouldn't want to use them long term. Last, I've mentioned throw ratio a few times, but for completeness, all the projectors in this video except for the Nexigo have optical zoom, and here are the minimum and maximum throw distances for each one to produce a 100-inch screen. And in addition to that, the LX700-4K, X3100i, and LS11000 also have vertical lens shift to help position your screen without moving your projector, and the LS11000 is the only one that also has horizontal lens shift. So all things considered, now it's conclusion time, and no matter what your budget is, I think that the BenQ X500i seems to be the best gaming projector on the market, with the ViewSonic X2-4K very closely behind. And looking at the projectors themselves and their stats, I actually wouldn't be surprised if they had almost the exact same internal parts. That said, the BenQ seems quite a bit more polished from a software and tuning perspective, and it also includes BenQ's QS02 streaming stick that has full Android TV 10 and Netflix support, while the ViewSonic SmartOS platform is basically worthless. So if you can get past that XPR motor noise at 4K 60, the X500i is not just the best gaming projector, but probably the best all-around projector that I've ever tested. If you're looking for better ambient light performance and your budget is a bit higher, like $3,500, I still think that the Nexigo Aurora Pro with a Fresnel screen is a nearly unbeatable combo, and I'm continually amazed at how it performs as a jack-of-all-trades, master of many. Tri-laser color performance, Dolby Vision, 3D, and fully functioning 1080p 240 Hz at 9.1 milliseconds of input lag is just crazy. If you really want a standard throw gaming projector, the X3100i is unquestionably better than the LX700-4K in every single way. But they're both really bright and have excellent gaming performance. But the LX700-4K does it for $800 less, so it still might be worth considering if brightness is really high on your priority list. The Epson LS11000 is a home theater focused projector that often gets recommended for gaming, but unfortunately, despite supporting 1080p 120 Hz and 4K 120 Hz, I don't think that it's a great option for a gaming focused setup due to the slow pixel pixel response times of the LCD displays, and the relatively high input lag compared to the DLP gaming options. I've got links to all the projectors in this video down in the description, and as always, I appreciate when you use those links, since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. Thank you to my awesome patrons over at Patreon for your continued support of my channel, and if you're interested in supporting unsponsored and unbiased reviews, please check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.